Yes.
Today's scripture reading comes from the Old Testament book of Micah, chapter 6, verses 6 through 16. Micah 6 through 16. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? The voice of the Lord cries to the city. It is sound wisdom to fear your name. Hear, O tribe and assembly of the city. Can I forget the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the scant measure that is accursed? Can I tolerate wicked scales and a bag of dishonest weights? Your wealthy are full of violence. Your inhabitants speak lies, with tongues of deceit in their mouths. Therefore I have begun to strike you down, making you desolate because of your sins. You shall eat but not be satisfied, and there shall be a gnawing hunger within you. You shall put away but not save, and what you save I will hand over to the sword. You shall sow but not reap. You shall tread olives but not anoint yourself with oil. You shall tread grapes but not drink wine. For you have kept the statutes of Omri and all the works of the house of Ahab, and you have followed their counsels. Therefore I will make you a desolation, and your inhabitants an object of hissing. So you shall bear the scorn of my people. This is the third week in our Doers of the Word series for the month of July. In the first message, we talked about how faith that is not demonstrated by actions is as useless as a screen door on a submarine. Last week, we discussed the fact that what we do or do not do for those whom society considers to be the least important, we really do or do not do for Jesus himself. And there are eternal implications connected with that. This week we move to the Old Testament, to the prophet Micah, who discusses what the Lord requires of his people and what the consequences are of not fulfilling those requirements. So our scripture passage this morning opens with the question, with what shall I come before the Lord? What shall I bow myself before God on high? And the person asking this question really wants to know how they can approach God. How can they come into God's presence? How can they present themselves as one acceptable to God? How can they worship and have a right relationship with him? As God's people, these should be the questions that are on the forefront of our minds. So the question asker moves into a series of suggestions of hypothetical sacrifices. The first is burnt offerings of yearling calves. These yearling calves were particularly prized because of their tender meat. So to sacrifice a yearling calf would have been a somewhat costly sacrifice. But the implied answer to the first question is no. That's not how you present yourself as one acceptable to God. So the questioner moves on to a second suggestion. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? We can see the escalation here, right? We move from yearling calves, and now we're talking about 10,000 rams and tens of thousands of rivers of oil. Now, this would have been impossible for most people. Only kings and rulers could possibly afford to sacrifice that many rams at one time. But the questioner moves on to the idea of oil, and oil is very valuable and very prized. And it would have been impossible for anyone, no matter how wealthy, to offer 10,000 rivers of oil. But even if these offerings could possibly be made, the implied answer to the second rhetorical question is no. The Lord will not be pleased with those offerings. Finally, the questioner suggests the most outlandish thing they can think of: a human sacrifice. Sacrificing their firstborn to atone for their sins, and thus making themselves righteous in God's eyes. What we see here is the growing absurdity of the question with exaggerating the sacrificial gifts. It seeks to show how ridiculous it is to think that solely following religious rituals and sacrifices in and of themselves will make someone pleasing to God. This is consistent with the teachings of Jesus, who in Matthew 23:23 said, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of the religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your earth gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things." Without sincerity, without remorse, without faith, without righteous living, sacrifices, just like modern-day sacraments and worship services and offerings, are meaningless and ineffectual. In verse 8, we make the switch from the questioner to Micah offering the answer. In our NRSV Bible, the first portion of this verse is translated as, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good." But a more accurate translation would be, "Hasn't he declared to you people what is good?" Scholars point out that there's a note of scolding and exasperation in this phrase. Like, guys, how many times do we have to go over this? Right? Why do you keep asking the same question when God has already told you what is good? As a teacher, a coach, a parent, I've experienced the exasperation of having to answer the same question over and over and over again. And I'm sure that you probably all had similar experiences. Micah says, God has already told you what is good. And this word good goes along with the next question, what does the Lord require of you? It describes what God demands from his people, a moral goodness in their behavior toward others. It refers to the right and true way to live one's life to benefit others, but it'll also end up benefiting the person who lives up to God's demands. Really what this question is asking is, what does God care about? The word translated here is as require, and what does God require of you? It can also be translated seek. What is God seeking of you? But it's an interesting word because it implies something that will be found. God is seeking something that will be found. God expects to find these qualities or these behavioral patterns in his people. It's not just an ideal, not just sentiments for intellectual assent or statements of belief to sign off on, but things that are meant to be expressed in practical living. As we'll see in a moment, the emphasis is clearly on behavior and not just on a set of beliefs. See, sometimes we like to relegate the religious life and the spiritual life to its own separate box, to the quote-unquote spiritual things, and only discuss those things in relation to the spiritual life. As if God doesn't care what happens outside these walls. As if what happens outside these walls shouldn't be talked about inside them. Sometimes we prefer to talk about high and lofty thoughts, beliefs and theologies, or on nebulous concepts rather than concrete actions. Dr. Stephen Dempster, the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Cranbrook University, wrote, "Churches may be concerned with quality, praise, and worship, large numbers in attendance, the ministry of the Spirit, and the hit pastor," which I know you're all concerned with, that's why you hired me. "But if anyone would challenge congregations with a concern for social justice in the poor, they might well hear the reply, stick to religious topics. Don't talk about everyday matters. Remain in the sacred realm where God's name is adored." Micah would vehemently disagree. So then Micah moves on to tell the reader what exactly it is that God requires of his people. There are three right responses to what God requires, seemingly to balance out the three wrong suggestions that the questioner offered in the first verses. And this is where it gets really important, so if you've been zoning out, I need you to tune back in here, okay? This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we get the answer, what does God expect of us? First, we are to do justice, to perform justice. Now, the word justice has been so adulterated in our modern political context. The term social justice, whew boy, you better stay away from that one, lest you be labeled as a social justice warrior, which for some reason is a term of disparagement. To all that I say, whatever. We're told that God requires us to do justice. To do justice is to help someone in need, to be an advocate for someone whose rights are being violated. Throughout the prophets, justice gains a special prominence against the background of the exploitation of the poor and not giving people their rights. The Hebrew word translated as justice appears 424 times in the Old Like God, we are supposed to be champions for true justice. Not just say we like the idea of justice. We are supposed to get our hands dirty, our feet sore, and our brows sweaty, working for justice on behalf of the oppressed. After justice, we're instructed that we must love kindness. The word translated kindness is the Hebrew word chesed. It includes concepts such as loyalty, mercy, fidelity, and steadfast love. It usually signifies help from a stronger person given to a weaker person. The phrase to love kindness suggests that this idea of helping someone in need should occupy a central place in one's heart and affections. Practicing justice is something that someone does, but loving kindness is something that someone is. And the latter will surely result in the former. One isn't supposed to help others just out of a sense of duty, but out of a genuine desire to help. See, we're not just commanded to do kindness, we're commanded to love kindness. Right? We can take actions without loving them, right? I take the trash out at home, but I don't say, "Oh, I love taking out the trash." Okay? We're commanded to love kindness, not just to do kindness. We're not only called to help others, but to have a burning desire in our hearts to help people. Finally, the person of God is told that he or she is required to walk humbly with your God. This expression means more than just following the stipulations of God's laws. More importantly, it refers to a life of a trusting relationship with the Lord. Since walking, at least in those days, was the most common human activity, walking denotes something which is done consistently, on a daily basis. So we're to walk with God daily and consistently. In other words, personal performance of one-time sacrifices totally misses the point. Personally, praying a one-time prayer to ask Jesus to come into your heart misses the point. We're called to more than that. What is necessary is not sacrifice, but a change from a life that's concerned for personal performance and what God can give to you, to a life in which a person gives his or her own life to God, to join him in the divine cause in the world of doing justice from a kindness-filled heart. This is what it means to walk with God, to engage in the things that he does. The remainder of the passage isn't really a pretty picture. It looks at the consequences of not living lives marked by the things required of the people of God. The Lord says that people have been hoarding treasures, gaining wealth by cheating other people, by taking advantage of them to gain even more wealth. In fact, it says you're wealthy or full of violence. This violence is the polar opposite of the loving kindness we discussed a few moments ago. It suggests that the wealthy would perpetrate aggressive attacks on the poor, which resulted in wealth and property being taken by force. This would also include cheating people. It would also include holding their debts and forcing them into bondage or slavery because of it. This word violence here is the same word that Scripture uses to discuss the violence that humanity was perpetrating before the Great Flood. The violence for which God wiped out all of creation and started over. Violence and injustice towards others are things which the Bible consistently puts forward as things which God hates. And in the description of injustice practiced by those who are supposed to be God's people, the image of dishonest weights is used, where sellers would tip the scales to give buyers less than they paid for, or to pay workers less than they earned. These images are economic in nature, but the application goes beyond buyer-seller or boss-worker relationships to refer to allowing any kind of injustice being perpetrated upon people, or any taking advantage of those who are oppressed. The result of this violence, cheating, injustice, lack of kindness, failure to walk with God, are some things that are known as futility curses. God tells the people they'll eat, but they'll never be satisfied. They'll sow, but they won't reap. They'll tread olives, but they won't have any oil for anointing. They'll tread grapes, but they won't have any wine to drink. I don't know about you, but that sounds to be somewhat like our modern culture. We're always seeking after more and more and more, but never finding the fulfillment that we desire. I mean, go to the mall and watch people wander around looking for the next big thing with eyes glazed over in a zombie-like state. Sorry, mall shoppers. But when we're not people of God, there's a hole in our lives that we try to fill unsuccessfully with other stuff. And not only does it not make us happy, it often leads us to perpetrating injustices on other people, contributing to the violence that wealthy companies perpetrate at sweatshops, not caring about kindness, just trying to find whatever it is that will fill that void. The great church father and theologian St. Augustine, which by the way is the correct way to pronounce that, famously said, "God has made us for himself, and we will not find rest until we rest in him." How do we do this? We do this by being people who do justice, who love kindness, and walk humbly with our God. Religious practices are not enough. The correct set of beliefs is not enough. It's not enough to say a sinner's prayer and say that you believe in God. These are not the only things that God requires, demands, and expects to find in the lives of his people. God is more concerned with how we live as Christians, how we treat others, than with the finer points of our theology. I've said it the last 2 weeks, and I'll repeat it here. I'm terrified that the church has abdicated its responsibility of teaching what God requires of his people and replaced it with the easy practice of saying a prayer and giving intellectual assent to Jesus in order to keep themselves out of hell. Just the other day, I was having a conversation with an individual who considers himself a follower of Christ. And he said, and I quote, "God did not call us to do justice, so stop the spin." This gets me so upset because there are potentially many, many people out there who think that they're people of God by virtue of the fact that they say they're Christians without actually doing the things that God requires his people to do. Churches have lulled people into a sense of complacency with a transactional message of cheap grace. That anything they don't agree with is considered spin. Friends, there's no spin here. Read it again if you have to. What does the Lord but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? These aren't the words of Alex Wright. These are the words of Scripture. This is what Scripture tells us God requires of us. This is what God tells us that he requires of us. I'm begging you to heed these words. If we do not do these things, we are not God's people. Plain and simple. We must be working actively for justice for those who are oppressed. We must love kindness not just in our actions, but deeply in our hearts and our souls. And we must walk humbly with God, seeking to emulate the example of Jesus Christ in all that we do, because he is the perfect image of God, and he set the perfect example of doing justice and loving kindness. Please pray with me. God, our teacher, our companion, you've shown us what is good. You call us to remember that what you require is not a repayment of debt or a sacrifice to settle the score, but obedience. Lord, remind us that showing up to hear your word on Sunday morning does little good if we're not doers of the word Monday through Saturday. Lord, don't let us have confidence in our religious strivings or hollow claims of transactional Christianity. But give us hearts that are pure in your sight. Help us to live lives of love, as did your Son, Jesus Christ. Show us, God, how to do justice for those who are being oppressed and mistreated, how to love kindness and show it to those who need it.